We are witnessing America as a failed social experiment.
How do we tell this story in a way that builds the kind of emotional momentum that colorblind ideology builds?
So many young brothers and sisters of the younger generation find themselves so far removed from the best of their past.
What are we going to make out of the nothing we've been given? How do you envision possibility?
Well, what's up, Tightrope community? Welcome to today's extended office hours episode. If you're watching this or listening to this recording and you want to be part of our future live office hours, you can become one of our patrons through Patreon. But if you're watching it live, this means you are one of our Patreon supporters already. So we thank you for joining our Patreon community, and we look forward to all of our future Patreon members to come. I'm Tricia Rose, and as I've said before, there wouldn't be no Tightrope without my dear colleague and brilliant friend, Dr. Cornel West, one of the greatest intellectuals on the planet. Cornel and I have been talking about this election on and off for days now, so we're really delighted to be here in conversation with you to talk about where we are. So, Cornel, the last time we were slogging through this election was election night, which was not actually election night. It was election discussion. We didn't come out with a winner yet. And so much has happened, but so much is still in limbo. So what's been on your mind? What are you thinking about? How are you processing this election season 2020?
Well, let me first say it's always a joy, my dear sister Tricia, just to be in conversation with you. And you know, there is no tightrope without you. And we thank our brothers and sisters of all colors at Patreon for being so supportive, trying to ensure that we can try to be the real forces for good that we aspire to be. You know, this election, it's a tale of two cities in a certain sense, because we were really pushed on the edge of the cliff, as my dear brother Cliff West, who's so much more wiser than I am, puts it. And we didn't go off that cliff, it seems. But at the same time, now that we're moving in a direction of a Biden-Harris administration, we began to see very clearly, you know, the shortcomings and the blind spots of that kind of neoliberal project that we've been critical of for a long, long time. And so on the one hand, you kind of have a sigh of relief and you say, okay, America seemingly hasn't gone fast. It's not, the process is still going, legal suits and what have you. But now that America's gone back to a neoliberal reign, and that neoliberal reign had some very disastrous effects, even though those disastrous effects will still be much better than an outright fascist regime, we have to refortify ourselves critically, politically, spiritually, and morally, and say, now let's continue to tell the truth about the Biden administration in the name of poor people, in the name of working people.
Yeah, well, that's going to be a heck of a project in front of us. You know, I guess, you know, what's been on my mind since we, you know, hung up our boxing gloves and, you know, on the night of the election is, you know, I guess I'm still really flummoxed and confused and upset that so many people could vote for Trump. You know, I mean, I get why people might have thought he was going to drain the swamp last time. That makes a little more sense, not common sense, but a little more sense than this time. And this time means that if nothing else, it means to me that pretty much almost half the country that voted believes that it's completely reasonable to have at least a narratively supportive white supremacy advocating individual in the White House. Minimally, this is bare minimum, who is not willing to eschew literal violent anti-Black groups and is comfortable with someone who has not 1 ounce of ethical behavior and is willing to constantly stoke not only racial division, but class division and anxiety and hatred and so on, and to try to squelch any critical discussion of racial knowledge in the country and its educational process. That means all of this is fine to them. Like, it's not even an issue. And so that brings me to one of my biggest concerns, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this too, which is that, you know, we're not in a situation where we can get to this question of healing, which everybody seems to want us to be at yesterday. I see people in their yard signs talking about healing. The next step is healing. People on the internet, the next step is healing. People on the news, people on op-ed. Man, healing is not the next darn step. I mean, you cannot heal something until you, first of all, figure out what it is.
That's
Second
right.
of all, handle all the injury and pain and inflammation, if we take the metaphor seriously. You know, some people have said, you know, you have to clean out the wound. That's the bare minimum. And then you have to really live with the fact that this may be a broken body that has to live with an open wound, right? It's not necessarily going to get healed. I guarantee you it's not going to be healed anytime this week. You know, I mean, but people are just going straight to healing. And here's my one insight, and I'm looking forward to hearing, I'm shopping it just to you right now and Patreon right here, which is that, so basically what I was really trying to say about this is that, there's no circumstance under which you can expect healing to take place. And by asking for healing right now, people are actually asking for the peace and quiet of a liberal, peaceful white supremacy on the backs of Black suffering. Because the only way you get healing now is by equally silencing white supremacists and silencing racial struggle for justice. It puts them on equal footing and says, let's just stop all this divisiveness, you two, right? Let's just quiet down and go back to the calm, peaceful white supremacy world we previously had. And that to me is more dangerous than almost anything else, because it demonizes Black suffering and the cries for freedom, justice, and humane treatment, and puts it on the same level as literal racial hate, all for the interest of a false healing model.
That is a profound formulation. That's why the tightrope is the tightrope. I'm telling you.
Yeah, that is a tightrope problem, isn't it?
But also, you know, you just don't get that kind of profound formulation in so many other media venues. And we have no monopoly on truth, but what you just said is something that needs to be heard in every household in the country. That when people call for healing, they're not really calling for healing. They're calling for calm and contentment so they can go back into their mode of denial. And that mode of denial is predicated on a false equivalency between the white supremacist sensibilities and orientations and moral responses and forms of resistance to it. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, let's just look at who actually voted for Trump. You got 58% of white brothers, 53% of white sisters after 4 years, right? You got 28% of our precious queers. You got 30% of precious Latinos and Latinas. 29 or 28% of Jewish brothers and sisters, precious as they are. So in other words, lo and behold, if it wasn't for Black folk, we would have gone off a neo-fascist cliff. And even in the Black community, you had some folk who were willing to lean for Trump. So
more brothers and sisters, though.
And more and gender. Bro. That's exactly right. And gender. So that before we even talk about healing, we got to get a sense of what was going on. Now, I do not believe that every person who voted for Trump voted just for white supremacy. You got a lot of folk out there who are in very deep hurt and pain and feel as if the neoliberal Biden and Harris is not going to speak to that pain. And when Bernie was unable to emerge, when he was crushed by the neoliberal corporate wing of the Democratic Party, they're looking for an alternative to the neoliberal establishment, and they swing to Trump rather than swing to Bernie. And we've got millions who did that, but not the vast majority of the folks, not the vast majority. So you got a certain heterogeneity in Trump's base in terms of who voted for him, but he's got a strong base among xenophobic, white supremacist, homophobic, and deeply sexist fellow citizens.
Right.
And so you're right. I mean, all this talk about healing, usually the folk who are calling for healing are precisely the neoliberal cheerleaders for the neoliberal Biden-Harris administration,
Right.
that somehow want to view themselves as exempt from serious self-examination and self-scrutiny. Yep. They spent $1.1 billion looking for the Biden Republican. This is what Brother Rahm Emanuel, this is the year of the Biden Republican. They got one candidate who won. All that money spent. Some of those consultants became millionaires and were told there's hardly any Biden Republicans out there, but they did it anyway. And what's the first thing too many of them do when they win? They start blaming the progressives. They start blaming the folk on the left. And you say, you got to be kidding. Those of us who invested so much of our time and energy, about the music videos in Philadelphia with Keith Benson and the drummer for Teddy Pendergrass, the meetings with Brother Anthony Williams and the Black Congressional Caucus in Pennsylvania, and it was Pennsylvania and disproportionately Black folk who pushed Biden and Harris over the line.
That's right.
Sister Stacy in Georgia, Brown brothers and sisters in Arizona, you say, wait a minute now.
Yep, you're exactly. And, I want to highlight one thing you're saying in particular, Cornel. I mean, everything you said is so powerful and important, but I want to really make sure we do shout out people on the ground. People came out. People came out. They came out to register other people. They came out to drive people to the polls. They came out to organize people, to have allies. You have teenagers who can't even vote, staffing polls because elderly people are more afraid of the virus right now and couldn't make it as they might have historically. You had the postal service, people working multiple shifts to make sure these ballots. I mean, people really came out. It really touches me, because even if it hadn't been relatively successful, right, that effort means something, right?
That's exactly right.
There's something very important about the soil in which that spirit can grow.
Absolutely.
So I was very moved by that. I mean, people were serious, and they were not taking this like whatever. They realized what's at stake, and they gave all they could give. I really believe that.
I mean, when I heard Brother Biden say, Black people had my back and I'm going to have their back, and it kind of hits the lectern, I said, ooh, now that's interesting. Because so often, a disproportionate number of our American citizens are Black citizens who end up saving the country from going off the cliff, and they're the first ones crucified. They're the first ones pushed to the side, kicked to the curb. They're the first ones whose suffering is rendered invisible. Once again, just get on the bandwagon and follow us.
Yep.
Wall Street, Pentagon, militarism,
mass incarceration.
Exactly. Right. We just seen it over and over and over again.
But he said it, so now we're gonna have to play it back. Although apparently you can say anything; it doesn't. Really
that's true. That's very true.
So I got another question for you. We got a couple minutes before we move to our next segment of our office hour. So I want to talk about Kamala and the claiming of Kamala, right?
Yes.
Because things have gone completely, mayhem around who owns Kamala. Do the Indians own Kamala? Do the Jamaicans own Kamala? Do Black people in general own Kamala, right? And then everybody, and then of course the related to the who Kamala belongs to question is the unbelievable, unabashed, just I believe I can be president now because there's a Black woman or an Indian woman or, going into the White House as a vice president. I mean, as much as I understand the salience of identity politics, I just get a little worried about this extreme 1-to-1 ratio, as if being a Negro means X, right? Being a woman means Y, being a Black, whatever it is. I mean, these things are not equivalent, and I just don't know how to explain that anymore, So, I mean, I was just shocked by it, and just people get so excited. Now, I'm not against Kamala. I'm not saying my point isn't about her. My point is about this identification. Are we so impoverished around belief because of so much crushing rejection that we can only imagine ourselves when there's somebody else in the job?
Yeah, but that's part of the impoverishment of a certain kind of narrow obsession with identity. If identity is not rooted in integrity, if identity is not rooted in courage, if identity is not rooted in solidarity with poor and working people, then you can play all the neoliberal games you want with diversity and equity and inclusion, and you end up just reproducing the class hierarchy. You end up reproducing the militarism, reproducing the mass incarceration, because mass incarceration has to do with the poor and working folk. It's not the professionals in the upper middle classes that get in on the identity politics being played. And so I think that, we salute Sister Kamala
Without a doubt.
Harris. She's brilliant. Her achievement is a historic achievement. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, we root identity and integrity, truth telling, courage, and what is your relation to poor and working people? And that's very, very real. In addition to her, though, I should say that I was a bit disturbed when she didn't mention her father. Because he's the biological source of her Blackness. Right. And whatever the relation, whatever the contention and conflict there, you would think that she would transcend that and simply say, I acknowledge my father. He's sitting there watching it in California, right? I mean, he's sitting there watching it, and there's no treating him like a non-entity, like a non-person in a certain sense. You know what I mean? Yeah. And her last name is Harris. It's not Nehru. Her last name was Nehru. She wouldn't be there. Everybody know that. Well, now she worked hard. She sacrificed. Her brilliance is, I think, undeniable. But there's no way she can be on the international stage,
right?
And somehow treat the biological source of her Blackness like a non-entity.
Well, right. I mean, especially given how important Black institutions are to her legacy. I mean, HBCUs train Black people to have the confidence of possibility that PWIs frequently destroy, not all the time, but frequently. That's right. And then her own relationship to the sorority and Greek culture and the Black
AKA, which is wonderful.
Right, very important support network. So it's not like just a little fiction, right, to have this biological link.
Absolutely.
I mean, it is hard. It's hard to transcend your childhood family wounds. It is a challenge.
No, that's true. And she has a right to try to wrestle with that in her own way. It's just that when she makes certain kind of choices, there are major consequences.
Yeah.
That's the thing about it, you see. And you don't want to reproduce the notion of the Black man as being just no good for nothing father who didn't support. And that's not the case.
Not worthy of mention, right?
Professor Donald Harris, I mean, the first Black tenured professor in economics at Stanford University, connections with Jamaica and all of its richness and all of its depth and all of its scope in terms of playing fundamental roles of Black struggle around the world in the Western Hemisphere and so forth. So that this notion that somehow you can just continue to be on this stage and treat him like a non-entity. I mean, it reminds me in some ways of when Biden was calling Black young brothers super predators, and thinking that you could generate a mass incarceration regime in alliance with Strom Thurmond, in alliance with Jesse Helms, who were already producing the old Jim Crow. He's now going to be an architect of the new Jim Crow, and it's going to be primarily the young Black brothers who are disproportionately going to be brought into the mass incarceration.
Man, you think it's that bad, Corn?
I just think that the Black man and all of our faults and foibles and all of our ups and downs, that we can't have somebody on the international stage just reinforcing a vicious stereotype.
I see.
You see what I mean?
But didn't she just not mention him? Did she reinforce? Did she say something that I'm not remember? I honestly don't remember.
But by treating him as a non-entity, people fill in the story themselves. Right.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's the
thing. All she got to say is,
the story's already there.
I acknowledge my father. Boom, I'm gone.
Right.
All you got to do.
Right. Yeah, and even just the Harris family, right? Which would mean begin with him and extend in all kinds of directions. Yeah.
Well, his mother, who she had a wonderful relationship with her grandmother there in Jamaica. I mean, it's not major, but I just think that this can come back to haunt her. She ought to just nip this in the bud right quick and keep moving.
Right.
That's what she needs to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you can do it these days. You can just Just a little bit of Twitter and you're all set.
A little bit of Twitter and think, hey, that's it. So that it's all the talk about blackness in terms of identity politics.
Yeah, where could it come from without Harris, right? Don't.
Exactly, without the brother himself.
Yeah.
So,
and Jamaica, blackness, and two out of three identities fall off the map.
That's the truth.
I swear.
And then you get Jamaica and you get India, Brahmin in India. We're
Right.
not talking about the dollars. Yeah,
Right.
so that has its own genealogy and history as well. But our Indian brothers and sisters in whatever form they come in, they're human beings who make choices in regard to integrity, choices in terms of courage, choices in terms of solidarity with poor and working people. Some
Right.
do, some don't. Black folk who come from enslaved U.S. people, they can
Right.
choose lack of integrity. They can choose lack of courage or whatever. It's a human choice we're making here.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. Well, thank you for that. That was a serious election recap, in my opinion. That was pretty rich. That was concentrated. That was some concentrated juice right there.
Just
I
following your
appreciate
Mary
that.
Lou Williams, following your Jerry Allen on the piano.
Oh, I wish
blowing
I
my
could
little
play.
saxophone with your deep blue on. Ooh,
I know.
I
I had to bring out the blue today because
That's all right. That's all right. We all love it.
Thank you. So we have a special guest now with us who's going to join us from our Patreon community. And so this is one of the really exciting things we've been looking forward to meet our Patreon family and to give them an opportunity to be part of office hours. Tom, are you there?
I am here. Thanks
All
for
right,
having me.
Tom.
Brother, it's a
much.
blessing to see you, though, Brother Tom.
Thank you. It's a big honor to be here. I've been a fan of the show since it started. I've been following your work, Dr. West, since I saw you on Bill Maher years ago. And Dr. Rose, I wasn't familiar with your work until this podcast started, but I bought Black Noise. I'm looking forward to reading that. So.
All right. Well,
you are in for a treat, my brother. In for a treat.
Thank
and
you.
we know you are the baby, the youngest of 9 magnificent folk in your family.
I am, yeah.
Wow.
Salute you, man. We salute
that means,
you.
Yes, well, you must have a whole family of readers and engagers, to be engaged as much as you are with our tightrope. We're going to celebrate your whole family.
Absolutely.
Being responsible for your curiosity and engagement. So we're really happy to have you with us.
Thank you.
So, okay. So you've got a pretty intense question. So the rest of you patronites, please, hang on to your seat because he's starting us off real. He's not no lightweight question. So let me read it to you right now. All right, everybody. Here is Tom Hall's question. And in case we have a question for you, stay by near us. Okay, Tom?
I will.
All right. So Tom wants to know the following. So there was a recent dust up in the online leftist community over Brianna Joy Gray's interview of Noam Chomsky on the Bad Faith podcast. Brianna Joy Gray asked why Black working class people should vote for Democrats, or as she put it, quote, blue no matter who, when the Democrats make no effort to earn their votes. Chomsky sidestepped the general question, Tom says, and Chomsky replied that because of the existential threat posed by Trump in this specific case, it was incumbent on activists to convince people to vote for Biden. I agree with him in the specific, and to be fair, I believe Brianna did too, but I'm still interested in the general question. So here it is. Now that the election is largely over, or so we think, my question is essentially the same as Brianna Joy Gray's. If the Democrats know they can count on the votes of Black people without offering them anything, what leverage do the people have to influence outcomes? And I'm going to turn this over to my esteemed colleague, Dr. West, to kick us off in thinking through this critically important question.
Well, Brother Tom, we want to thank you for starting this whole series on such a high note, because that is a fundamental question. And though I agree with Brother Noam Chomsky and Angela Davis and Bob Avakian and Paul Street and the other left-wing activists who have been exemplary in so many ways of voting for Biden, we've always thought you have to tell the truth. And the question about the Black working class is a different question than the Black upper professional class. The Black upper professional class is going to cash in on the Biden-Harris presidency. It's going to cash in on the diversity programs of corporate America. It's going to be able to gain opportunities in the upper echelons of American society. But your question about the Black working class, and in many ways, this is true for working class folk across the board. Nina Turner has made this point with tremendous power in her piece in the Washington Post a few days ago, that the Black poor and the Black working class will be left behind if the Biden-Harris administration does exactly what the establishment Democratic Party elites have traditionally done. So it will look like, in the name of identity politics, that Black folk are benefiting, but it will be class skewed. It will be benefiting those at the top of the Black community. It will not be benefiting those at the bottom or the Black working class. So the way you ask that question is very, very astute, because we begin to see how class is inseparable from race and race is inseparable from class. And we shouldn't think that because Black professionals are doing very well, that the Black community as a whole is doing very well. And then the question becomes, well, how then do we focus on Black poor and Black working class folk? And we thank God, for Brother Bernie Sanders and others who've been trying to raise this question. But we may end up reaching the conclusion that the Democratic Party simply doesn't have the institutional capacity to speak to the Black working class and the Black poor. So we have to look elsewhere. It could be People's Party or any other major alternative. That's an issue that many of us are wrestling with right now. But I know Sister Tricia's got much to say on this too.
Yeah, no. I mean, that's critical. And thank you, Tom, for this rich question. We looked at it and we're like, oh boy, this is not a casual thing. So, I mean, everything Cornel said makes perfectly great sense to me. The thing I would say on a slightly different angle is that, I don't think of Black working class people's votes for Democrats as a waste insofar as they don't get their needs met, partly because I think most working class people don't get their needs met by any of the Democratic voting process. So what that means, if it were true that only Black working class people were the ones not being listened to, not being heard, whose livelihoods and agendas were the only ones being undercut, then I might have a different response. I might be more in line with the critique of blue no matter who, as Brianna put it. But because it crosses race, this problem, I think of a Black Democrat investment as an effort to basically, tamper down on the wounds that the political class creates, and that it's really a short-term sort of survival strategy that I don't think should be diminished, because I do think when you are in poor communities, or you come from them, I think that, or you are likely to believe, and I think it's true, that surviving in the short term is the key to long-term survival. There's no point in a long-term survival if you can't make it to next month. So the question is, why are we always in survival mode, right? And how can we get out of survival mode in terms of long-term planning and expectations? And to whom can we turn for that opportunity? I don't think that, third-party voting is going to solve that in this climate. I think it's a very pragmatic, grounded response. These are the alternatives we have, and we know this one, like, life is going to go on tomorrow one way or another. So hopefully, what does that mean? What will it look like? Will it look like a horror story, or is it going to look like a mildly psychological thriller? So I want to keep it down to a psychological thriller and not be an outright horror story. So to me, it's not a confusion. Where I would press the issue is my last point. Where I press the issue is to say, how can we organize Black communities in solidarity with other affinity-like communities, whatever they may be, to really pressure the Democratic Party after the election? And do we have enough of a base of a movement to say, okay, look, we threw our hat in with you, And now we have a whole lot of demands that we want answered, just like other constituencies get what they get. They get anti-abortion agendas met. They get, other evangelical agendas met. We have our agendas. We want mass incarceration to come to an end. We want restored voting rights for everybody. We want, equal pay. We want jobs. We want equally funded schools, whatever it is the list may be. And we need to keep that pressure up. So the issue isn't the vote to me as much as it is, what are we doing after that? And that's where our leverage should be. I don't know if that adds anything useful, but that's the part I would add. Cornel, I turn it back
And
over.
that's no, I think that's crucial. That's crucial. But Brother Tom, did you want to say a word though, brother? Respond.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciated, Dr. Rose, your point about the world is going to keep going on tomorrow, because that's what I say. I did not want to vote for Biden this time around, but as I said to other people, something is going to happen in January. Like one of two people at this point is going to be, inaugurated as president in January. If I don't want it to be Trump, then I need to do what I can to make sure it's Biden. And so yeah, I appreciate the pragmatism, but
Yeah. And, I mean, it is true that we've voted and let them continue to do what they do. And that's not our fault, because there's a ton of manipulation and people say all these things and then they don't do them. And people got to go to work and they got to raise their families and they got to try to put food on the table and try to stay out of the police precincts. I mean, this is a full-time, any one of those things is a full-time job. So I understand. But at the same time, power responds to pressure and power. Power and pressure doesn't respond to, I voted for you and now I'm going to send you a memo, about my expectations. So I think this is a claim for us doing more and pushing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the key though is for all three of us not to allow any practical decision to dampen our fire that continues to bring critique to bear on the neoliberal politics of a Biden and a Harris that's still too tied to Wall Street greed. It's too tied to Pentagon militarism. It's still too tied to the relative silence on mass incarceration and so forth. It's still too tied to the kind of foreign policy that we're going to see now,
Right.
where American power in Africa and AFRICOM extended and the Middle East and so forth. So that as long as we have that fire, that practical judgment is just one moment that pushes Trump back, pushes fascism back, but allows us to recognize the kind of solidarity that Sister Tricia was talking about. In the end, is going to have to be the way we go, because we're in an immoral dilemma. We've got to choose to vote for Biden when we know he's not going to speak to Black working class, white working class, Latino working class, poor across the board. And yet we got to push Trump back. And when we push Trump back, then we're quickly forgotten. Because we just keep track of his pro-Wall Street policies. It's going to kick in so quickly. Keep track of the militarism, that he's not going to cut that military budget and so forth.
Right.
That's where our voices need to be heard. That's where the pressure needs to be put. And, AOC and a few in the Democratic Party, I think, will lean in our direction, but it won't be enough. It won't be enough. The Democratic Party is already talking about, what did it say? They don't want to hear the word socialism again. as if it was the left wing of the Democratic Party that opted for all this billions of dollars looking for Biden Republicans. Please.
Exactly.
Please.
Yeah. And, I think though, this was a very sophisticated ground, strategy among, politically organized Black communities and Black organizations and other people of color in solidarity, and et cetera. And so we need to keep that pressure alive. Everybody needs a bit of a break, because we're all completely exhausted. And I know the groundswell, Tamika Mallory and others have been traveling the country, Rashad Robinson, Color of Change. I mean, a lot of organizations doing very important work. So everybody needs a good sleep and, a little bit of nourishment. But now is the next stage, right? As Tracy Ellis Ross was saying, now we get up and fight some more. Like, this was not a victory dance. This was a save yourself from, a horror show. And now we still got work to do. So I mean, I think that's the real rub to that discussion. But Tom, thank you so much. This was so great to have you. Thanks for being our first inaugural Patreon live guest conversation during office hours.
Yeah, it was exciting. Thanks a lot for inviting me.
No doubt.
Oh,
You're
no.
welcome back. Come
We
on
thank
through.
you though, brother. We thank you though, man.
All right. Take care, Tom.
Stay strong though.
All right, we got another Patreon question, Cornel, from another member who is not with us, but we will read the question. His name is Brad Moore. And Brad, thank you for sending in a question and being part of the Patreon tightrope world. So now we have Brad's question. Here's his question here. In my view, a lot of the social unrest in the United States that we've seen lately is the manifestation of decades and centuries of miseducation of our youngest citizens. How can people with the means litigate these issues in the courts most effectively? Oh, how can people without the means to litigate these issues in the court most effectively to fight back against systemic racism and disenfranchisement as it relates to public education, pre-K through 12 and post-secondary?
I saw it on the note here that Brother Brad is in the house, which is wonderful.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Yeah, Brother Brad is in the house. So just we want to salute you, Brother Brad.
Thank you, Brad.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's
Yeah,
another
yeah.
very important question. But we know public education, any form of education, is fundamentally about trying to get the high quality attention of students so they focus on the things that matter, like truth, like knowledge, like justice, like decency, like integrity, like honesty. And there's no doubt that our school system, for the most part, is failing in that regard. Most of our school systems don't have in their curriculums the full truth about American past and present and future, let alone the full truth of the world's past and present and future. We have very narrow frameworks to understand the United States. Don't want to tell the truth about the slavery, don't want to tell the truth about the workers' movement, don't really want to tell the truth about women's subordination and the Mexican War and how California was once Mexico and became part of the United States and so forth. You know, these are painful truths that's oftentimes are just too much for the narrowness of the public school system. So we just have to have teachers who care enough about students that they care about the truth and knowledge and can give them and see the best of America and the worst. Anytime you see the worst of America, there's been Americans who have fought that worst. That's the best of America, you see. And so we need a broader framework to understand the truth about America, knowledge about the American past, how it relates to the present. And this is true, you know, at Brown University, it's true at Harvard, just as it is in public schools. But what would be your take, my dear sister?
Yeah, that's very true. I mean, you know, the thing that really moved me about what you started with was, you know, that isn't about the subject. This is how I translated what you said. It's not about science or about philosophy or about English or about novels. It's about our character. And the moment you start with that, right? Are we going to be about courage? Are we going to be about truth telling? Are we going to be about compassion and so on and so forth? Now we pick the subjects after that, right?
Absolutely.
Because it's not about the content. But we're so technocratic on education right now. It's all about, you know, what's my goal? How can I use this information to gain a leverage point one way or another? So that's one main thing. But I think, you know, the denial of the flaws of the development of this nation, the colonial history, the history of enslavement, the stealing of the entire nation, it's the continent, the Northern American continent, from the indigenous people, all of this, the fact that we can't even address it in any reasonable way has made most citizens more brittle. And the more brittle they are, the more they bristle and fight against hearing that which makes them uncomfortable. But if we could figure out how to listen to the reality of the situation and believe, because of the ethical decisions you've laid out, Cornel, believe that the next step is a process of reconciliation and reflection and transformation, and to see that on the other side is the loss of that brittle kind of defensiveness and that
Yes.
shocking denial of how am I going to survive now that I know I come from a colonial people? Oh my God, it's like, well, okay, you've been surviving okay without knowing. So, let's work on what assets are going to be accrued by knowing. So to me, it's about the psyche that has been destroyed in relationship to this. It's made people unable to be the warriors for justice that they could be. You, Cornel, and I teach, African American studies, among many other things. But I find, and I don't know if this is true for you, but that when people know who haven't heard and who haven't been paying attention, of course, there's shock and outrage and a stage of grief because it's horrible news, a lot of it. But once people feel like they can be aware and have a certain kind of, I don't quite want to say mastery, but knowledge and empowerment by knowing, then they move to other stages of relationship to the material, right? And that is what we really need, right, to solve this situation. I have one last thought about this, and that is, I think we have the kind of technology now where we can get around this problem. Right. If we take the curriculum basically to the virtual streets, and that's some of what we're doing here on the tightrope, right? Creating, content that people will challenge these brittle kinds of consciousnesses and encourage people to keep forging forth to say, look, this knowledge does not break you. It empowers you to do the right thing, to have the courage to do the right thing. And I think we just have to use more of our resources in front of us as much as we can to really dispel the kinds of consciousnesses that this educational system produces.
Absolutely. And this is another reason why, people talk oftentimes about speaking truth to power. Mm-hmm. And that's badly needed. But we also need to teach the truth to the relatively powerless. Mm-hmm. Because poor and working people, wherever they are, they also need to know the truth about themselves and ways in which they can be empowered. But the truth about themselves, about what they're up against. I'm right now reading a magnificent book by Brother Braxton Shelley. He's a professor here at Harvard. It's on gospel music. It's on a genius named Richard Smallwood. He's one of the greatest gospel composers since Thomas Dorsey. And when Smallwood was at Howard University, and we love Howard and all of its complexity, they had to sit in 1968 just to have gospel music as part of the music curriculum because it was only European music at the time.
Right.
And so with Smallwood, the total praise, we know all of his great contributions and songs, that what Braxton Shelley is able to show is we had to speak the truth to a magnificent institution, Howard University. Our dear sister Kamala Harris comes out. My dear brother Larry Morris, who's now head of the chairman of the trustee board. He's one of the most finest citizens in the country. That Howard produced some high quality folk, but it didn't want to hear painful truths about Black people because the gospel was associated with Black poor people and Black working people. And Howard for so long was producing a Black middle class that was obsessed with European music. The European music, beautiful at its best, but music by Black poor people and working people, James Cleveland and the others, you can't think about.
Can't touch it. You
can't touch it. So it's this process of speaking the truth to whoever in public education, at Howard, at Hampton, at Morehouse, at Spelman, at Harvard, at University of Chicago, Long Beach Community College, whatever it is. You see.
And we don't need to wait till people get to college to start speaking the truth.
Absolutely. You start kindergarten with those graham crackers and the milk.
Kids know a whole lot more than we give them credit for. And they process all the anxiety, the high rates of mental conditions. They're living, they're experiencing the mendacity and the schizophrenia of the context that they're living in. And by telling people, no, look, there really is a hierarchy. It's not supposed to be, but there is. And here's what it looks like. They'll be like, now this makes some sense. It's not going to be like, oh my God, that's shocking. It's going to be, thank you. I remember when I first was given sort of a structural explanation for things that I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was a profound relief it didn't bring me down. I was like, oh, so that's the game
That's
up in this
what's
place.
going on.
Exactly. I was liberated by that. Now, that's not true for everybody, but there should be access to that information as much as possible. And so
But
what I
given your precociousness, though, that probably happened at about 3.5, 4 years old in Harlem.
I
Sister
did. I did
Tricia,
have some. Yeah, there's a funny story. I'll tell you another time about that. But they were going to close the public library on 145th Street in Harlem, and I had to be 5 years old, and
wow.
I was furious about it. I was like, "Mom, we got to go to the public library and try to protest and make it stay open because, we need the library." And I was all the way over there. I was huffing and puffing. I'm just learning to read, and they about to close my library. So we get to the place, and there's a camera. And my mom says, well, tell the man with the camera, what you just told me. And she says, I refuse to talk to him. So she said, well, but this will get your word out to more people. I was like, no, I'm not talking to him.
No, you already had a healthy suspicion of the press anyway. This little sister sounded like Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker already. What's going on?
I was mad about that library. But, again, I think everyone comes with a different disposition, but,
Yeah.
we still need to have this truth telling because we owe it to our kids. And I would want to tell Brad in particular, we need to fight public school programming and curriculum. You pay taxes so that your kids and our kids and everybody's kids can be miseducated, as you put it, rightfully so.
Yeah, that's true.
And so we need to make sure our money is being spent, not for the police to bash people in the head and not to crush the intelligence of our young people. So, we have to do a little bit more about that. But thank you, Brad. That was a really great.
Thank you, Brother Brad, keeping the standards high.
Yeah, I tell you. We are starting off on a high note.
On a high note.
All
We
right.
appreciate Brother
Yes.
Brad Moore, indeed.
Yep. Thanks for joining us. And this is getting us off to a fresh start. Okay. So now we have Paige Hopper. And Paige has 2 questions for Dr. West. One is, in your opinion, what personal priorities do Black Americans need to focus on right now? So she's saying personal priority, or they're saying personal priorities. And then in your recent Tightrope interview with Tracee Ellis Ross, you spoke about Black Americans beginning to, quote, emptying ourselves out for the healing of others. Can you elaborate on what this looks like and how we should go about it?
God Almighty, Lord.
Yeah, that's a
the
lot. That's a lot of salad there, bro.
You got a whole lot there. Her name again was
Paige.
Sister Paige. Yeah, I would say that. The 2 challenges of Black folk ever since the dignified African got off that vicious slave ship and entered the slave auction and onto the slave plantation is not enough self-love and too much poverty. So that we've got to learn how to love and respect ourselves, straighten our backs up and live in such a way that no matter what our circumstances are, we still have a dignity and integrity. And secondly, we have got to abolish poverty in all of its forms because we've traditionally had too many poor people. Now, how do we do that? Well, we got to join movements like what Brother Barber and Sister Thea Harris and others are. We got to raise our voices so that the treatment of the Black poor becomes a measure of how the Black community progress is measured. Mm-hmm. So it's a different lens through which one views the world. And so on a personal level, that means you live a life of self-respect. You live a life of dignity. You live a life in which you indeed want to be a force for something bigger than you, which is abolishing poverty. Now, that second question had to do with
can you elaborate on what you said to Tracee about how we have to begin to empty ourselves out for the healing of others?
No, those 2 questions are connected. That when you're living a life holding on to the best of your human ability to integrity and dignity and trying to speak the truth and seek justice, you are opening yourself, you're giving yourself, you're serving others, you are donating yourself in terms of time and energy and the gifts that you have. You're there to serve others. That becomes a benchmark of greatness. And you want to be a morally and spiritually great human being, an habitual vision of moral and spiritual greatness.
So service is how we should go about it. That's
Absolutely.
service. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, that's why people's commitment in this election was so powerful to me. I would say a lot of it was very much that what you've described as
standing
emptying
8
themselves out.
hours, 10 hours in line to vote.
You know, lines that are completely unnecessary, but we'll leave that for another
that in a
discussion.
pandemic too.
In
I
a
mean,
pandemic.
it's really something.
Yeah, and bringing everybody. Well, those are great questions. Thank you very much, Paige. All right, we're moving through our amazing list of Patreon peeps. I think that's what we should call them. I've decided Patreon peeps. Our Patreon peeps. Okay. We have Victoria Sosaya. And the question is really does capture the mood of where a lot of people are right now. And so let's see if we can help out with this one. Victoria is saying that she's feeling so discombobulated with so much tension in the world. I do my best to respect everyone, but I think that no one is truly free to be themselves. How can one navigate this chaotic world while maintaining kindness and love for people who hate us, disagree with us, or people we disagree with, and on the border of starting to hate? How can we maintain kindness and love in this chaotic, hateful, conflict-based environment?
Yeah. Did you want to take a stab at that one, and I could try?
Okay,
That's a tough one now.
That is a tough one, but
that's a tough one.
I mean, I think I guess, and I'll stand corrected from Professor West on this if I have this wrong, but you're kind and you love not for the other people, but for yourself. And it's almost like wearing a mask, because, you think the mask is there to protect you, but it's there to protect others. It's kind of like that in reverse. You're kind and you love because your spirit, by staying open, creates a climate and a condition for more kindness and love. Whereas if you don't actually follow that through, then you end up perpetuating the thing you're most hoping goes away. So you're not kind and loving because you're waiting for somebody else to be kind and loving back. And so when I turn it that way, I mean, that doesn't mean I'm always kind and loving. Sometimes I talk beneath my breath and roll by and say, that fool voted for Trump, and it's just a shorthand of irritation, right? And sometimes you're afraid, right? Because you look at some people and you think, boy, if it were dark out, I don't know what would be going on right now. So there's fear and there's worry, but I guess for me, the navigation is really trying to be kind and loving and still holding your ground about what you believe in, right? You don't have to live on top of a lie. You got to be willing to hold your ground and say, look, this is not acceptable to me. And I'm not going to go out of my way to harm you, but I'm not going to let you have the last word about this either. So I guess that's my simplistic approach.
Yes,
right there.
No, that's not simplistic at all. And it's here where my own the revolutionary Christian faith comes in, that, to be a follower of Jesus who goes straight to the temple and runs out the money changers with a level of righteous indignation such that they end up putting him on a cross as a political criminal for running those money changers out. That he's kind and he's loving, but he still has a righteous indignation for those who will exploit poor people. So that same Jesus says, well, you love your enemies. Why? Because if you follow me, you're going to have so many of them. And you don't want them to be the point of reference that dictate how you live your life. Right. That they're there, that when their deeds are such that it requires a critique and resistance, you do that in the name of love. So kindness and decency is not a political strategy. It's not a utilitarian calculation. It's your way of being in the world. You choose to be loving and kind, but for those who are crushing those you love, you have a righteous indignation to run them out of the temple.
Right.
Now you may end up on the cross, so you got to think things through. But
Yeah, you definitely want to think that one through.
You gotta think, but that's the risk, and it's true. You know, you love your mama, and somebody gonna mistreat your mama. You gonna have to. You hate that fact that she's being mistreated, and you gonna respond. If you don't respond, the rocks gonna cry out. But
Right.
that's the way the world is.
But
For those
Cornel.
who have that kind of love.
Right. Imagine someone's in a workplace where they're surrounded by people of the opposite political disposition, right?
Right.
And they feel like they're going to lose their job if they say anything, or, maybe they live in a neighborhood filled with, Trump signs and they're Biden supporters and they're keeping quiet, or vice versa. Although I think most of the hate does not seem to be coming from Biden side of the equation here, but that I could be completely biased and therefore missing the point. But how given how heightened everything is right now, maybe it's not only about when they're deliberately disrespect, but just how do you survive that kind of climate? You know what I mean? How do you keep your equilibrium?
Right. I just think that, again, we've told our precious folk who listen to us all the time, never be surprised by evil, never be paralyzed by despair. So you don't give those folk a whole lot of weight.
Right.
In terms of how you go about living your life. But when those folk engage in vicious behavior, you have a righteous indignation. You hit the streets, you organize, you demonstrate, you bring power and pressure to bear against their deeds. But you can't be a person who's just reacting all the time to evil. Nobody can live a life like that.
You can't live it. You just got to turn on some good music and let that go.
You got to have something outside of that in terms of family, love, music, arts, solidarity with the poor, whatever it is. But you're not naive. You know it's there. You know that, in fact, the white supremacy is there, the predatory capitalism is there, the militarism is there, and so forth.
Excellent. Yeah, that helps me out. That's why I had to rephrase it, because I was trying to think like, what about when your neighbors have signs? I don't mean to piggyback, Victoria, on your question, but I was just, that's well put.
Victoria, raising a deep question. Once again, we've got some folk Patreon that's
we got a deep community.
Highly impressive.
Yes, indeed. Okay, I think we got one more question here. It's from Fadi Antoun. And Fadi is asking this. I'd really appreciate a conversation about Tupac and hip hop in general in the fight for Black lives. His mother being in the Black Panthers, that certainly influenced him from a young age. He grew up fast and found the power of rap in conveying a message through music. Tupac is not really spoken about in the talks about the recent history of social justice in the 90s. The government was definitely aware of his influence and they didn't like his message, and there's a reason for that. I'm going to let you kick us off since
all right. Well, I'll start with a very personal note. I've talked about this all the time. I was blessed to teach at the Timbuktu School at House of the Lord Pentecostal Church, 415 Atlantic Avenue, under the great Reverend Herbert Daltrey, National Black United Front. And Tupac would be on the front row, and I would lecture every second Wednesday with Charles Barron and Inez Barron. Those were some good days. Finney was there, Tupac's mother, who was a member of both the church and had been a member of the Black Panther Party. So I can remember Tupac's lovely eyes just focusing on me. Oh, he's got beautiful eyes as even a young brother. We're talking about Garvey, we're talking about Malcolm X, we're talking about Martin Luther King Jr., we're talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, we talked about jazz, we talked about rhythm and blues and so forth. Now, I didn't know he was going to become the towering genius that he did become, but I think Tupac certainly had a level of courage, vision, charisma that the powers that be were highly suspicious of. And Tupac is like all of us. He had a whole lot of freedom fighting in him. And he did exercise and enact some of that potential, but he also had thuggish life in him. He put it on his own body. And by thuggish, what I mean is going through life thinking as if you're able to resolve conflict by means of you imposing your will. So you end up having the capacity to subjugate and manipulate others too. It could be women, it could be gays, lesbians, other men, or what have you. So he had this civil war taking place on the battlefield of his own soul. That's true for all of us. And he, as an artist, he just displayed that in a very, very open way. And Tupac remains one of the great artists, not just a Black folk of America, one of the great human artists of the last 50 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Wow, I didn't know that you basically ran, lectures and classes for Tupac.
He's
That
right
adds
on the front row.
another source of distinction in your rather extraordinary life.
We love that young brother.
I mean, the only thing I would add is that, Tupac left enough of an ambiguous legacy that it's understandable why he wouldn't come to mind immediately in terms of thinking of social justice in the 90s, because the late 80s, early 90s had groups that were more explicit about politics, that would make Tupac be sort of closer to the gangster rap equation of the binary between, say, socially conscious MCs and the ones that would be considered more thug life oriented. That said, I think compared to what happens after the turn of the century, 2000s on, Tupac begins to look more and more like a social justice warrior. In other words, in hindsight, right, the trajectory of sort of, capitalism, get mine or die trying philosophy, that hip hop begins to go further and further toward, Tupac looks like a, social justice activist by contrast. So it really is about context for me with a little bit of Tupac. And, what I'm so sad about is that he didn't live long enough to resolve some of these kinds of conflicts, because the industry, it was very manipulative, and he was vulnerable to all of the institutional structural pressures, the destruction of Black communities. Mass incarceration was, was already in almost full tilt at the point that he was, working. And there was a lot of, there was no critique yet, no major critique of what we would now call kind of toxic masculinity in hip hop, right? The fans would just allow all of this beef and conflict and threatening each other, as a sales ploy, sometimes as a record industry strategy, but also as a reflection of the time and the chaos and sort of fragility of the communities. So to me, we should raise Tupac up, but we have to be comfortable with his ambivalence, right? We can't turn him into an activist. Just because he comes out of a legacy doesn't mean his body of work and his body of actions are sufficient to place him squarely in that tradition without a big asterisk about other behaviors that really contradict it.
Absolutely. And I would just tell, the name of the questioner again was
This was hold on, I've already forgotten my Fadi Antoun.
Oh, Fatih, yeah. I would just say that you'd want to read Professor Tricia Rose's work on the emergence of hip hop and the variety of different voices and counter voices, prophetic voices, middle of the road voices, and so forth. You'd want to read Bakari Kitwana. You'd want to read Michael Eric Dyson's early stuff on too. There's a number of folk who have been wrestling with these kinds of issues at a very, very high level, so that the fact that people might not be talking about Tupac as much in 2020, that he is going to come back. A great artist like him is going to come back. He will not be forgotten. There's no doubt about it. But there's been these marvelous minds that engage Tupac on a number of different levels, and you'd want to make sure you read their works so you get a chance to be able to sustain your own understanding of the great Tupac, the genius of Tupac, on a high level, like those writers and scholars who I mentioned.
Yeah. No, it's very, very powerful. And yeah, Tupac had both a spirit and he had a voice. His, the sound of his emceeing, there was a depth, a warmth. It was almost like he was really rapping from his gut. Everything felt like it came really from his gut, and that feeling that he invoked had its own political resonance.
Absolutely.
There was a kind of honesty in him that is relatively rare.
That's true.
And certainly in hip hop. Well, thank you,
That's so
Fadi,
true.
for the terrific question. We really appreciate it. This has been, like, I think, a fantastic inaugural Patreon
Absolutely.
community conversation.
Absolutely.
And so, do you have any closing thoughts, Cornel, before we let our first office hours come to a complete close? Any thoughts you want to say? Anything?
Well, again, we just salute our brothers and sisters of all colors with Patreon for the magnificent support, the confidence you have in Sister Tricia and myself, trying to the best of our ability to say what's inside of us
Mm.
in these very grim times, and to do it with a sense of humor. Of course, Tricia does it with a sense of style that I aspire to, but also to engage the richness of the subject matter, which is the doings and sufferings of too many folk in the world, no matter who they are.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm going to allow that to stand because I have nothing of that magnitude and value to say. I just agree that we just try to do the best we can do. And we're honored that you're here with us and that you're sharing it with other people, which you are, and because people write to us and say they're looking forward to things. And so we're just really grateful for the feedback. We want to make sure that if you're watching this later and you missed this Patreon special, that you do join up so you can get the first round of conversations, and join our Patreon community and subscribe and share and let us know what you think. And just thank you all again for joining us on the tightrope. And we're going to keep trying to swing and hang on as best we can in the midst of all of this foolery, and all of the grace at the same time. So thank you very much for being with us, and we'll see you the next time on the tightrope.